What is up, team? Welcome back to the show. Today, I'm joined by my man, Jeff Hoehn. Jeff, thank you for being here, bro.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, man. It's an honor to be on this side now on your podcast. So I'm excited to dive into it.
Of course, dude. I'm fired up to have you here, man. You deserve a bigger audience. You know your shit so well, and I'm really stoked for this conversation. But before we get into it too much, can you give the listeners a background who might not know just who you are and what you're up to?
Yeah, so I'm based out of St. Louis, Missouri. So I'm in the Midwest. So I've been so basically I've done a couple bodybuilding shows in the past, natural bodybuilding, and then as you know, I got ready for a photo shoot for you for just social media posts. And so basically, I run an online training um, fitness company and work on nutrition. It's usually clients that are just looking to just get in better shape, just build some muscle, lose body fat, your basic stuff like that. And then like, I also like to dive into things on how to fit it into your lifestyle to, I like to teach clients basically how, you don't have to go all in on everything. You can have some balance. So I like to teach that. And I'm really enjoying the nutrition side of things. So that's something that I'm really diving into. I'm currently pursuing my master's in human performance and nutrition, which I'm hoping potentially to get my RD, but this is going to help open that door for that. So that's something that I will pursue in the future. And then as far as, I know we're going to talk about this today, but one thing that I am very passionate about is hypertrophy. And I love building muscle. I like to just, like my goal right now is to just build as much muscle as I can. And I love the hypertrophy side of things.
I love it, man. I think we're very much the same where it's like, I love nutrition. I love you nerding out about other shit. Oh, but I love training too. And like, I love all these different aspects of it. One thing I want to clarify for the listeners too, that photo shoot wasn't for me. Like, it was definitely, we worked through that together, but just so there's no confusion there, that was more like exclusively for me or anything of that nature.
Yeah,
But
I guess if you said for you, that would be kind of weird. But yes, you helped me get ready for the photo shoot.
just so there's no confusion on that end, but we can talk about that later if you want to, dude. Anyway, cool. So again, man, you have a wealth of knowledge, and really one of the biggest reasons I wanted to bring you on was to dig into hypertrophy training specifically, aka training for building muscle. Because I know especially you have a position at the online trainer academy as well, like specific to program design, correct? Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so basically the Online Trainer Academy. So it's a personal trainer development company. So if anyone's familiar, it's Jonathan Goodman's company, and they recently launched a new service called the Online Trainer Coaching. And so what it is basically is it's just a service for training, basically for trainers. People who, how it is, like you spend time programming all day. The last thing you want to do is do it for yourself. So basically, it's a program through that, and then they asked me to come on recently to help be like the head programming coach. So they have a guy that does the templates already. His name's Joe Dodell, and he does that. And then basically what I do is I do coach some people there, but also there's like 4 coaches underneath him. And if those coaches have any questions in terms of programming, they'll come to me and ask me. And then 2, if somebody's been with them for more than 2 cohorts, basically they have those 2 programs already designed. And then what I would do is I just see where the client is, and then I uh, basically take their programming to the next level. So it's a little bit more of the like second tier of that programming.
Dope, cool. So let's get into it then, man. When it comes to hypertrophy training as a whole, like hypertrophy training program design, do you have a couple key principles that you're looking for when you're building a program, or like a couple key principles you think people should keep in mind when they're building their programs? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So like So the main thing though is I tell all clients this, and anyone that's like looking to get into building muscle, like the biggest mistake I see people make is they are just very random with what they're doing. And so obviously the main thing there is getting some consistency there, but it's not so much the consistency, it's the progressive overload that is super important there. So that's going to be the most important thing. We need progressive overload in our training. So that's probably the most fundamental thing to build muscle. If every week you're, obviously if you're doing different exercises, you don't really know if you're progressing, and you're not going to build muscle like you could if you have progressive overload in your training. So the first fundamental thing that I focus on is making sure that we're getting better over time.
Right.
And I know, and this is the mistake that I used to make, and I'm sure you made it as well too, where you'd go to the gym, you'd be working hard, you'd work 5-6 days out of the week, maybe even 7 if you're crazy. I did 7 at some point too. And, I was just frustrated with the lack of progress. And what it came down to is I didn't have any structure with my training. And it was, what did I do last week? Oh, I think I did like 225 on bench. I don't know how many reps I did, but I'm just going to see how many I can do today. And
Right.
It's just like, you just kind of spin your wheels that way. So that's like the first thing that I'm dialing in with clients is we're just focused on getting just very consistent with our workout routine and then progressing from there. I think that that's the most fundamental thing.
So really, I know when I first started training, I would go in and like, okay, how many, or when I worked up to the point where I could do 225 on bench, right? It was how many times, like, okay, how many times can I bench 225? Like, and then every week, okay, can I try to beat last week's performance? Like, and that in and of itself, honestly, like, hey, can I try to beat what I did last week? In and of itself, of course, we could talk about like the importance of deloads and even like undulating intensity. That's probably though not even like we're doing the same movement so we can measure progress over time. But I know there were a lot of other movements where I'm just doing everything at random. Like, what sounds like a good movement to do for my chest today? Or what is literally every movement for like legs that I can think of? So like I remember like talking to a dude when I worked at the campus rec center, and it being like and this is a little bit off topic, but like he's like, oh, I trained legs today. So I did back squats, front squats, leg press, goblet squats, and walking lunges. And like I know that's like when I first started training, that was the approach I take. Like, what is every movement I can think of for this specific muscle group? Okay, cool. I'm gonna throw all that in there. But a little bit off topic, my man. So biggest thing is overload. Any further thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, and you make a good point there. Like I know I see this, honestly, I still see this in the gym all the time. Like you see somebody training and they're doing their best, right? Like I don't mean to be like to shit on these people, but they're doing their best and they do what they think is gonna work. But you see it like people will do a lat pull down this way, then they'll do like close grip, then they'll grab the mag bar, and it's like you're just doing way too much stuff there at that point, and the quality's probably not there. But as far as a progressive overload goes, this is again, this is why we do what we do. We tell people we preach the importance of progressive overload, but I'm sure you still see this with clients when they first come on, like they have the work and they think that that's like the magic there. And so sometimes they won't track at the beginning. And like, I have to have that conversation with them constantly in the beginning. Like, hey, I know that you have the workout and you think that's an important part, but really what we need to do is you need to make sure you're tracking the workout. So that way, you're overloading over time, because just having this workout itself isn't going to cause you to build muscle. It's going to be making sure that you're progressing over time. And so like, I have to have that conversation regularly with new clients. Like, hey, make sure it might not seem like a big deal, but it is a big deal to track, even if it's body weight exercises. Make sure you're tracking those things too.
Absolutely, dude. And I think, again, that's one of the biggest pieces most people are missing. And I know I have the same conversation with new clients. The first couple of weeks is always like, yo, here's what we can change to make sure we're getting better data. Or like, and I know that's always something we touch on, like when we shoot over new clients, their plan, but still a lot of times it's like these first couple of days, okay, there's no data here. So like, since I adjust your plan based on how I'm seeing you progress week to week, like we don't really have anything to work with here. And like, how are you going to know you're progressing? How are you going to know you're actually pushing yourself? So I love that, man. Anything else on progressive overload?
With that too, I think with the progressive overload too, it's people think that the only way to overload is just by weight. And we know that that's not the only thing too. So like, you teach progressive overload and the first thought is, hey, I'm just going to keep adding more weight to the bar. And it's like, well, that's good. And
Right.
You definitely want to get stronger over time, but that's not the only way to do it. And I think that can sometimes be a mistake for clients, because what happens there is instead of focusing on quality of the exercise, it just becomes, hey, I just need to beat last week's numbers, or just add more weight. And we know that the heavier the load gets, we want to lift more weight over time, but weight in itself is not the most important thing. And you don't just have to keep increasing weight every single week. From my understanding, there's a larger threshold, like an overload threshold, and it doesn't have to just be just weight, and it doesn't have to be every single week you increase either. Just over time, just like with clients, I'm sure you preach this and I preach this too. It's with like weight loss, we don't need to see weight loss every single week or weight gain, but over time we want to see it trending in the direction we want, right? Like there's going to be some weeks where maybe it doesn't go down, but same thing with progressive overload. Like just because you don't have to do it every single session every single week. But again, obviously having smart coaches like you watching over the program it's going to help the client realize that. But too, yeah, adding like sets, reps, like those are all going to be things of progressive overload. It doesn't just have to be weight. And I feel like that's one kind of misconception with progressive overload is it's just weight.
That's such a good point, man. And we'll dig into like progressions across the mesocycle later on, so we can dig into that a little bit deeper. But I know that's something I'm not, I think how you program is probably pretty similar to how I program with like a progressive RIR and like relatively progressive volume, right?
Yes. Yep. Progressive. Yep.
Cool. So I think like one of the hardest things with that system where like across weeks we're moving closer and closer to failure is, and I mean, on paper, if we're decreasing RIR every week, we should like in theory be able to add a rep most of the time, right? But it doesn't always play out like that in real life. And like to your point there, one thing I always said, because that can often get clients into the mindset of like, if I didn't add a rep or add a little bit of load this week, then I failed. That workout was worthless. Like I had a client emailed me the other day, like, hey, I didn't progress from like last week. So does that mean that all that volume I did was just pointless? I was like, no, that's not how it works. It's like, very much, we just haven't, there's so many other factors outside of just training and nutrition that can impact that, like your sleep, your stress, all these other variables. But again, it's still like, it's not like it's either just, okay, this is effective volume and it was effective enough to get you to another rep, like increase strength by another rep or a bit of load, or you didn't progress at all, right? There's very much like a gray area there for a good amount of time. So that's a great point with progressive overload. Like it doesn't, I think people get a little bit too fixated on it. We always have to add load, which I know has come back to bite me in the past. So with clients, do you have any like, this is kind of a vague question, but do you have any rules of thumb you typically give people when it's like, okay, how do we walk the line between, am I executing the movement well enough? Or like, how do I know when I need to add a bit of load? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So basically, like, how do we know that we need to improve like technique over when to add weight type?
Exactly. How
Basically.
do you choose like which way to go? Like, hey, maybe you shouldn't add weight. You should sit here a little bit longer versus, okay, we should add.
I think a couple things you would want to ask, and I would ask a client is because you get that question a lot, especially with online clients. It's like, hey, when do I know when to add like load, basically?
Or hey,
And
what weight should I use this week, right?
yeah, or what weight should you use? Yeah, and so I think that's where something like, let's say you're doing a bench press. Like if you start to get to the point to where you're not feeling it in the target muscle, like that's a time where you're probably increasing your load a little too quickly. So if you're getting to the point where, yeah, like if you're not feeling it in the target muscle and it's more like joints, like let's take the bench, because I feel like that's a classic one where it's like just keep adding load to it, right? If you start to feel it more in your shoulders, then chances are it's probably all right, you need to cool it on the adding load and instead start to increase your reps there a bit more on that, and make sure that you're really feeling it in the target muscle. I think that's the biggest takeaway there. And what I would tell a client is, hey, like, where are you feeling this? If it's let's say it's against the bench and it's more on the shoulders, okay, let's cool on the load increases and let's focus more on rep increases and technique there. I think a good thing with the bench is something like, hey, focusing on potentially, slowing it down on the way down, maybe doing like a touch and go where you slow down, touch, and then come back up rather than just coming down. Because I know I've done this a lot in the past, and sometimes I still do it where like it's the last week of a mesocycle. You want to try to beat last week's number on there, and next thing you know, you're getting the weight up, but is it in the most effective way? And I feel like, again, if you're not feeling it in the target muscle, like you've been there, like you felt it great in the first week, and then week 4 or 5, it's like, again, your shoulders start to take over a bit more, and it's like, okay, I probably jumped on the weight a little too much too soon.
Absolutely, dude. I think the counter to that, it is a fine line, because I know also when we go to, okay, I know I've had this conversation with clients, and then sometimes it can swing too far on the other spectrum where clients are thinking so hard about the mind muscle connection that again, it's like, hey, we could probably push a little bit harder here. So typically what I tell people is, I know sometimes, like at least most of the times when I have this conversation with clients, like, okay, how does this movement feel? Like, how do you feel like your disruption was? How was the pump from that? How was the mind muscle connection? Typically, like how I like to frame it with clients is these things come as a byproduct of good execution and basically putting your body in the proper positions throughout the movement, right? Not necessarily like trying to push your head, push your brain inside of the muscle and really, really think about like exactly what that's doing. And I think that's like a common misconception because again, I think it can go too far where clients are like, all right, so I'm going to use super light lows. I'm going to go so slow and really try to think super hard. Where it's like, okay, like focus, almost like stay external. In my experience, that seems to typically work best. Like focus on execution, but not necessarily so much like what exactly am I feeling, and then that kind of comes as a byproduct. Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think that's a great point. I think that people can take that too far and go too light, and then they're not doing enough weight, so it's like, you tell people, hey, slow down, feel it on the target muscle, but then that just gets overblown. Like I've seen people in the gym where, they go super slow with the tempo on the way down. It's like, okay, time under tension is important, but at some point, you can do, your tempo can slow down so much and you can focus too much on the mind muscle connection that you have to drop the weight so much that then that weight is not stimulative enough. It's under your 30 or what would that be, your 30 RM, 30% of your 1 RM. And like, that's just like, okay, that's too much then at that point. So yeah, you can definitely take it too far. And I know I've probably done that as well, where I focused on form and technique to where then then you're not lifted enough weight. So there is that fine line. And this is what's crazy about building muscle is like it's like, well, you have one camp that says lift more weight, then one's like lift less. And it's like where, I can see where there's a ton of confusion with it.
No, absolutely. And I think in my experience, it's somewhere in the middle. Perfect. Cool, dude. I mean, go ahead.
Well, and like, yeah, I think that again, I think there's probably times where something like, there's probably times where you're going to go heavier than normal, and then there's times where you're not going to go as heavy. And I think that just not varying one or the other, I think is super important. Like I know, somebody that's always lifting in the 5 to 7 rep range or 6 to 10 rep range, the one that they do, maybe they would probably benefit from dropping the load a little bit and going higher reps on stuff and focusing more on the mind muscle connection. But then you have those people that they don't want to go heavy. They think they'll get bulky or whatever from going heavy, but they're only in the high rep range. They probably would benefit from a little bit heavier of a weight.
No, absolutely. Absolutely, man. I couldn't agree more. And I think it's basically like execution and intensity are both necessary. And it's kind of pointless to say we can't really have the gains we want without both, right? Cool. So progressive overload, I think we've covered pretty well. Main principles you were looking for past that. What do you got?
So another one would obviously be progressive overload, and then another one obviously is just intensity with your training. Like that's going to be super important. That's one that I feel like people miss over is, obviously we want progressive overload, but at the same time, so let me back up here. One other one that is super important that I think does get overlooked is specificity, right? Like making sure that, okay, so obviously we want progressive overload in our training, but if we don't have specificity, we're missing out on what we're trying to do. So what I mean by that is, if your goal is to build muscle and you're running multiple times a week, 4 or 5 times a week, you're not being specific to what your goal is. And so that's super important, right? You got to make sure that what you're doing is the stimulus is building muscle, right? Like, and again, you can take that, you can do endurance running, and that's not going to help you build muscle. So you could have progressive overload where you're overloading your running, but is that going to build muscle the most effectively? No. So we need to make sure that what you're doing is specific to building muscle.
Absolutely, dude. And I don't know about you, but like so many new clients, they'll hop on board. For whatever reason, I think this is a lot more common in women. Like Beachbody, I think is very good at like marketing, and I don't actually know what their marketing is like, but I know a ton of women hop on board that have come from like, hey, I follow like this high intensity style of training. I want to build muscle, but basically how I'm training is this circuit style of training where we're never like getting that close to failure, and it's all focused on intensity and like sprint intervals mixed in the mix and all these different things. And it's like, well, yeah, like that's very non-specific to like the stimulus that you're providing doesn't yield the adaptation you want, right? And I feel
Yeah,
like that's such a common thing that we see.
yeah, absolutely. Right. And like, you see that, and that is common. I feel like you said, that is more common with women, the more like circuit type. And again, that kind of goes back to, they're doing more like high rep sets, and they're doing that, but they're also not doing overload with it, right? Like it's something different every week. But one that I see is, and this is more with guys, I feel like guys that struggle to put on muscle. One that I see commonly is, a guy, you talk to a guy, he's like, oh man, I've been trying to put on muscle, I just can't do it. And you look at what they're doing throughout the week, and they're playing a bunch of sports. They do like these high intensity activities like bike riding, or more like mountain bike riding, not bike riding itself, but they're doing that. Um, I have a client who I just picked back up. He does rock climbing, and like he does all this stuff, and like it's, that's good, and you should stay active. But if your goal is to build muscle, like there needs to be a time where you focus more on that rather than all these extra activities that you're doing, because that will hurt your muscle growth in the long run.
No, absolutely, dude. I love it. As far as specificity, anything else you want to dig into there?
With specificity, it's just, it's kind of on a spectrum, right? Like there's going to be, can you hear that in the background?
You're good.
No. Okay, cool. In terms of specificity, there's it's kind of a spectrum, right? Like far away is going to be things like endurance training, and then closer to it's going to be things like strength training. So like strength training would be like, obviously we know that lifting weights is going to build muscle, but if you're constantly in the like 1 to 5 rep range trying to uh, build muscle that way, like it's going to help, but it's not going to be the best for building muscle, right? So it's kind of on a spectrum there.
Right. Cool. And I want to dig into exercise selection in a bit as well, and even rep ranges. So that'll be helpful too.
Yeah.
Kind of continue this conversation. So then as far as the main principles, I know you mentioned intensity as well.
Yeah. So intensity is going to be like how hard you train. Like, again, you could, maybe you're doing specificity, like you're training to build muscle, you're overloading, but then maybe you're not training hard enough, right? Like it's not like, obviously if you overload eventually, I think you'll get to the point where it's hard training, but you could be spending a lot of that time just not training intense enough. And so one thing we like to use, and I know you use this, and this is one thing I picked up from like Steve Hall and Renaissance periodization, is using reps in reserve, making sure that your training is challenging, right? Like, because again, you could be training, you could be doing all these things, but if it's not challenging, are you actually growing muscle? So, I like to use the reps in reserve. Basically what they've shown is, you hear this argument of should you train to failure? And, there's some pros to training to failure, but always training to failure is not great either. So what we find to be the best is usually around like 2 reps in reserve, right? So 2 reps in reserve, that's usually when the bar starts to slow down a bit. That's one thing that I didn't use for the longest time, but I really like using that is hey, once like your form starts to slow down a bit, that's probably, you're at a good point there. You're probably about 2 to 3 RAR.
Right.
And so, going to failure has been shown to cause more muscle growth, but what we forget to look into is the fatigue that comes with training to failure all the time, right? Like obviously, again, if you train to failure all the time, yes, you'll grow more muscle, but you don't think of the long-term effects of the fatigue that comes along with that. And, fatigue obviously is not great for building muscle, because at that point you're going to spend more time recovering than you are actually building muscle. So we find that about 2 RAR is probably best, and then give or take, 1 or 2. But yeah, making sure you're training intense enough is super important for building muscle.
Absolutely, dude. And I think that's another very overlooked piece. Again, it so much depends on like where the client is coming from. I think that people typically fall in 2 camps, like when they hop on board. Either and I would say that a lot more clients fall in this camp, at least that we tend to attract. They've just always trained balls to the wall. But then like the specific, when we're talking about specificity, like okay, maybe I'm trying to build my glutes, but like my training is absolutely all out. But then the actual rate limiter and the movement is in my glutes. Maybe it's like the fact that I'm just exhausted because I haven't been taking in long enough rest periods. But that's such a good point, man. Go ahead.
Well, one other thing on that too, and this is interesting. Like you'll see, you have the one camp where it's like they train balls to the wall all the time to failure all the time. Um, and again, I don't usually you see that more in men, right? And then on females on the other side, they're the ones that it seems like they train a little bit further away from failure when it comes to building muscle. But when I had a guest on the podcast a couple months ago, Martin Ruffalo, we talked about training differences between males and females. And like one of the things he brought up was females might benefit more from training closer to failure just because they have smaller muscle, their muscles on average are smaller. They're smaller than men are. And so like they can handle training a little bit closer to failure. So it's almost like there's that mismatch when we kind of need a switch, where people are at.
The male versus female training differences are so interesting too. We were talking about this when we met up in Scottsdale or in Phoenix, right?
I
think so.
I think so. Yeah.
A couple drinks, so but I think we're talking about like the amount of just like looking at the amount of volume so many of our female clients can do relative to like what we would do. Like for example, like when I program for you, dude, like your lower body are stupid. How I'm pissed off when I like 2 sets. It's like 4 total sets in a training day. But like the amount of volume you need, and that said, like the context of that is different. But I know even like when you were still trying to grow your lower body, it was like very, very low volume. Whereas I know so many of the women that I work with that are like more intermediate to advanced. And I think you said this was the case for you as well. Like because women can typically recover quicker between sets and quicker between training sessions, it seems the amount of volume that they can handle to continue to grow it's not like it's like, okay, I do 3 sets of this girl did, or like this female did 10 sets of like back squats or anything of that nature, but there is a pretty decent difference anecdotally between like what men and women can usually handle or even need to grow optimally. Have you noticed that?
Yeah, for sure. Well, it makes sense too when you think about it. So men have a little bit more like type 2 muscle fibers, and those are like the strong, forceful muscle fibers, and those are the ones that are going to they fatigue quickly. So and again, men usually have just more muscle in general, and so like more muscle is going to take more time to recover, right? Bigger muscles are going to take more time to recover. So it makes sense that men can do more, or men can do less. Females can do more volume than men can. And then too, like, and this was something that I've noticed too with my clients, and I've heard this too, where like if you look from like set to set, if you're following RAR, you'll see sometimes with men it will be like 10, 8, 6 or something like that. But with females, it's usually just like 10, 10, 10, and it's like you're kind of asking them, are you actually following RAR? But most of the time they are. It's just like they recover, their work capacity is much higher and they can recover super quick. Just overall, on a shorter time scale and on a longer time scale as well.
That's such a funny thing because that is something that I've talked about with so many of my clients too. And for a long time, I was the same way. Like, yo, we should be seeing this drop. Are you sure you're like taking it there? And so like I remember having a couple of women like shoot me form videos and okay, yeah, you are hitting your RIR target. It is, and that's like. I'd be interested to hear your take on this, man, because I know like typically like when I'm looking through a client's like progressions week to week, if I see too many sets where reps are the same, load is the same across all the sets, for dudes it's almost always like, hey, you're probably either sandbagging the first couple sets or you're taking the last couple sets too far to like try to match reps. But for women, I'll typically still like, hey, this is a little bit more common in women to like you would be able to match performance across sets, but still just like audit yourself, make sure that, or like, hey, shoot me some form videos. If it's like everything, then I'll typically still like, hey, like just shoot me some form videos of these movements. Like I want to rate your RR to make sure like I feel like we're gauging this accurately as well. But that is an interesting insight because again, I feel like there's a conversation that I've had so many times as well, but there is a pretty big difference there.
Yeah, for sure. And it is a challenge. And like, I think that, I don't know where this, but it seems like, if you give a client a rep range, like they want to hit that rep range and they want to like anytime they like, and it took me a little while to change my mind on this too. But like, anytime they get whatever they get on the first set, it's almost like they feel like they have to get across the board for some reason. And like you said, it may be something where like that first set's 5 RIR, then it's like 3 RIR, then 1 RIR, right? Because I mean, that's kind of what's going to happen there at that point. Like you're going to be sandbagging those first couple sets.
Right.
Um, and again, I've listened to like Dr. Mike talk about this, and they they mentioned there's no like right or wrong way to do that. It's just you have to just realize that your first set's probably not going to be the best, but then that last one's going to be a lower IR, and that average, you just kind of average it out a little bit. But I like to teach, hey, let's try to stick to 2 RIR or something like that throughout all three or all the sets.
I like it, man. Cool. So main principles you're looking for. Anything else?
I guess another one we could hit on too real quick is just fatigue management. This is one that gets overlooked a lot by people. They usually people that are hard workers, they can't miss the gym, they got to be in there every week. They're usually the ones that are missing out on this fatigue management portion of building muscle. And basically fatigue management is just making sure that you're, obviously you're pushing yourself hard in your training, but also making sure that you manage that fatigue that comes along with hard training, right? Whether it be, hey, making sure that you have at least one off day throughout the week, or making sure you don't do too much in one session. Also taking periods of like a deload week from training, and then sometimes maybe even like a active rest phase, or like what Steve Hall calls a primer phase. Making sure that you again take time to recover from training too. Because again, if you're always just pushing yourself, it's just at some point something's got to give. You can't just keep pushing yourself. You can't just keep progressive overloading each week. Like how it is. Like when you first got into training, you could overload every single week, and then eventually, the longer you get into it, the more it's just like, it's like I can't go any further. And I feel like that's where a lot of people they get demotivated, and that's where they end up spinning their wheels. They push it for 8 to 12 weeks, progress every week, and then all of a sudden, that moment there's a little plateau. They probably just need a rest, but they're like, no, I got to push through. I got to get into the gym and do this. I can't miss. And then you get burnt out or get injured or something like that. And missed time from the gym is going to hurt your gains more than anything.
Oh, absolutely, dude. And that's, again, I think like most people that sign up for coaching with us are people that are very good at pushing themselves, but almost to like a fault where, like you said, you can do that shit for 2 to 3 months. You can push hard, but you're going to hit a wall. And eventually it'll get to the point where you're just so beat down. You're trying to grind through it, but you're not seeing progress. You're probably even regressing by this point. And then eventually people typically are like, well, fuck this, fall off for a couple weeks or a couple months. Then like, oh shit, I feel great again. Okay, I'm back on it. And kind of rinse and repeat that cycle. Whereas like 3 to 5 weeks of accumulation, deload, rinse and repeat is how you actually create sustainable progress.
It is, but it's so hard to get people to buy into the taking a lighter week, man. I mean, I don't know about you, but it's always a challenge to get people. They're like, wait, what the hell am I doing? What's the point of this? And it's having that conversation is important. Again, that's like why you mentioned having a coach or somebody there with you to guide you is super important for this.
Oh, absolutely, dude. And I think it's much for like people that are very good at pushing themselves hard as anyone else. That's like, because it's not just like, hey, let me motivate you, give you a kick in the ass. So much of it is like, let's look at the objective data. Do you need a deload now? Yes or no? Like, I know I've had so many clients hop on board and it's like, they're so hesitant to like take a diet break or like take time at deload. And then like the week after that, it's like, oh my gosh, thank you for making me do that because that was so helpful. But go ahead.
Well, no, that's a great point. Like usually the first couple times you do one, I don't know if you do this, but if somebody is fairly new to training, I'll kind of push them out a little bit. I'm not going to take one every 4 weeks. But like if someone's new to training and they're getting back into it, you can probably push it out longer. But man, all of a sudden you throw in a deload, they're like, what the hell's going on? This sucks. And then next thing you know, they're messaging you the next week and they're like, that was amazing. And then they start looking forward to that every 4, 6 weeks or whatever.
No, absolutely, dude. And I couldn't agree more, dude. The fatigue management is such an overlooked part of it. Because I think so many people think like, hey, I just need to smash myself in my training. If I push myself hard enough in my training, the growth that I want will come. But like, if you look at like the SRA curve, for example, it is very much like, okay, we create, like in simplest terms, imagine your body's at a baseline right now. And we could, of course, debate how I'm about to lay this out, but to simplify, body's at a baseline right now. You hit it with your training stimulus, you drop a certain amount. Like the greater the stress from that training session, the lower we like drop here. Your body has to recover and fully bring it back to the previous baseline you have to recover from all that. And then if we have enough recovery resources and recovery ability, then we can actually grow past that point. We have to even just get back to our previous baseline first, right? And that's like when we're creating too much fatigue. So many people also get into this trap of like where the amount of fatigue created is so great that they can never actually recover. They just like spin their wheels because they're basically just bringing their body back to the previous baseline, training super hard again. So that's such a good point, man.
Yeah, and that's a trap that a lot of people get themselves in. It's a combination of under recovery and just not eating enough too. People are scared to eat, and that's obviously going to play a role in that too. That's going to help you recover, and it's a recipe for disaster if you're always pushing yourself, not taking these rest, these times to lower the fatigue, and then on top of it, you're not eating a lot of food. Like you're just, again, like you mentioned, you're going to spend most of your time basically just repairing the damage from the training, and then it's back again, and there's no time to actually grow or whatever it may be.
Absolutely, dude. And again, that's where it's almost counterintuitive to like most people who do like they want to push themselves very hard, which is such a great skill to have. But again, it's sometimes like doing a little bit less actually gets you more.
Yeah, and I'm sure you see this. I feel like the people that need it are the ones that you'll talk to, and every couple months you see them, and they're like, "Oh man, I'm gonna hit it. I'm gonna get back into it next week. I fell off," and it's just like, "Oh man, if you could just learn how to take that rest period, you won't be having that issue of needing to take time off from getting burnt out or whatever it may be."
Absolutely, dude. So I'd love to dig into on a similar note because I know that something that was very helpful for me when understanding this was stimulus to fatigue ratio. I'd love to just dig into that a bit and then kind of carry that into a conversation around exercise selection. You cool with that?
Yeah.
Cool. Or did you have any other main principles you wanted to touch on?
No, I feel like if you can be specific with your training, overload it, and then take time to get rid of that fatigue and train, make sure you're training hard enough. I mean, those are going to guide you for long periods of time to building muscle.
Perfect, dude. So when it comes to the very specific to building muscle and actually being able to recover from your training, we kind of have this idea of stimulus to fatigue ratio, which I know is something you consider pretty heavily in your programming as well, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep, absolutely.
So could you give us a quick breakdown, if you don't mind, of like what stimulus to fatigue ratio is, why it's important for hypertrophy training?
Yeah, so stimulus to fatigue ratio would be like, again, so we talked about earlier, hard training is going to produce fatigue, right? So we know that if you're training hard, you're going to generate fatigue. That's just unfortunately what happens when you push your body. So basically, stimulus to fatigue means that I don't have a great definition of it, but basically, it's going to be what you're doing in the gym is generating, it's stimulating enough to build muscle, but it's also not super fatiguing. So something that would violate this stimulus to fatigue would be something like let's take a rack pull. Okay, so a rack pull, right? You can lift heavy amounts of weight with it, but so it's going to generate, so the intensity of it's going to be super high, so it's going to generate a ton of fatigue, but it's not really stimulating much, right? Like it's not really building much muscle. There's not a lot of range of motion in it. It's just a very short range of motion. So really what you're doing there is you're just generating a ton of fatigue and you're not getting very much stimulus to it. So essentially it's a poor stimulus to fatigue ratio. And you could even argue something like the deadlift too is not exactly the best stimulus to fatigue ratio. Now it could be for some people, but again, it's one of those lifts where it hits a lot of muscle groups. Nothing that it really stimulates heart like a ton, but you also have to use a ton of weight for it to be effective. And so it's just adding a ton of fatigue to you, right? You're just generating a ton of fatigue. And so again, for building muscle, it's not the best. But each person's going to be different with the stimulus to fatigue. There's, for some people, one lift may be a great stimulus to fatigue exercise, but for another person, it's a poor one. It's just going to be based on how it feels for you. So there is some, it's not like one exercise is going to be great for everybody, but that would be a kind of an example of stimulus to fatigue there on that.
No, dude, I think that's perfect. Basically, just like, okay, how much stimulus are we getting from this? Basically, this specific movement, is it giving our body a strong muscle building stimulus? Does it kind of show you somewhere in between? On the flip side, how much fatigue are we creating with that movement? So like you said, the deadlift is a great example of that. You get pretty fucking tired after you deadlift. Like doing 5x5 heavy deadlifts, you're going to be smoked. So a lot of fatigue. That said, like, and of course, like you said, this varies by individual, which is the beauty of it. But like, okay, for me, when I do a 5x5 heavy deadlifts, do my hamstrings really feel that stimulated after? No. Do my glutes? No. Does my back? No. I feel exhausted, but I didn't actually stimulate that much muscle growth, right?
And what does that do to the rest of your training for that day, right? You're so zonked from that, you can't really do anything else because you're so tired. And so it's like you did a lot of work for not a lot of muscle growth. Strength, though, crush the strength part of it, though.
Oh, exactly. And again, like that's the context of it is so important too. Like if you're a power lifter, is a conventional deadlift probably a good movement to do? Of course. But like if we're in here when we're talking about truly hypertrophy training, most of the time, like a conventional barbell deadlift or a sumo deadlift typically isn't something that I program, at least. Yeah, man, I think that's pretty, I like, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say too, and it depends on the person, right? And how long they've been training. Like someone that's fairly new and they don't have a ton of time to train, something like a deadlift may be a decent exercise for them because they don't have to do a ton of weight for it to be stimulating for them, right? They can get away with doing less when the fatigue's lower. So it may be a better choice for them. But as you progress and you have to lift more weight, it becomes a worse stimulus to fatigue ratio exercise.
Absolutely. And I like Renaissance periodization's model of like when we're actually quantifying this. Okay, on one end, if we're looking at this as an equation, stimulus over fatigue. On the stimulus side, we have mind muscle connection, we have pump, and we have muscle disruption. Not things that like in and of themselves, like, hey, am I gonna build my program specifically for like the mind muscle connection or specifically to chase a pump or specifically to get super sore? No. But like all those together are probably a sign that like if you're feeling a decent mind muscle connection on an exercise, you're getting a decent pump from it. And afterwards you can tell like, ooh, okay, I can tell I trained that muscle. It's probably stimulating a decent amount of muscle growth. And then on the fatigue side, we have joint or connective tissue stress, perceived exertion, and I think non-target joint and muscles. I think non-target joint stress, if I'm correct. But basically, okay, then how much fatigue? Again, and really we could look at this is, does it make your joints hurt? Does it make you tired? And like the greater the degree you can say yes to either of those things, probably the greater fatigue cost you're incurring for like the stimulus. So then we have to be smart with the movements that are more fatiguing. Are they like, is the stimulus worth the amount of fatigue that we're creating? Right. So to dig into then exercise selection, and then one last thing I want to note on that quick before we move on actually is then typically like I don't know what your take is on this, but typically like the big barbell movements. So really what I would say is like the movements that put more stress on your spine. So think like any deadlift variations, even a Romanian deadlift, barbell back squat, front squat, overhead press, barbell bent rows. Those are typically going to be the ones that are the most fatiguing, right? Typically, like the degree of axial loading, or again, like how much our spine is loaded is typically pretty correlative with more fatigue. So those are the ones I think where especially you need to consider, okay, how much stimulus am I getting from this? And like be smart with those and choose like, okay, let's say like my back squat is amazing for my quads. But on the flip, so that's one to keep in. Like I get a crazy stimulus. But on the flip side, when I do a barbell bent row, I don't get that much stimulus. But when I do like, okay, so maybe, but it's a lot of fatigue. So maybe, okay, let's plug that in for like a chest supported row or cable row. But yeah, do you have any other thoughts on that before we move on?
Well, I think one thing to keep in mind too is just because it's a good stimulus to fatigue ratio at one point doesn't mean it's always going to be that way either. Like over time, the longer you do the lift, that stimulus to fatigue ratio is probably going to decline too. So, definitely keep that in mind too, because again, let's go back to progressive overload. Like over time, you want to be increasing the weight. So like say, for example, bench press, when you're doing 185, it's probably a good stimulus to fatigue ratio, but say, 3 months down the line, all of a sudden, you're just getting a little burnt out of it. You're up to like 215 on it, and now you start to feel it more in your joints. Well, the stimulus to fatigue ratio is down on it, right? So just because it's a good one at the beginning doesn't mean it's always going to be a good one too. So definitely something to keep in mind with that too.
Cool. I like it. Actually, while we're on the conversation, before we dig deeper into exercise selection, I would ask then, what's normally the criteria you look for or you think people should look for when it's, okay, when do I know whether I should swap out a movement or not, or continue to like try to progress this?
Yeah, that's a good question. My thought on it is, if you go in and you're just like, you got to the point you're just like, I do not want to fucking do this. Like, okay, that's probably a good sign. Like, hey, it's probably time to switch it up. Again, are you feeling it more? Is the lift just getting like just tough? Like, is it just, again, it goes back to the motivation part of it. Like, you don't want to do it, but is the lift just getting harder and harder? Is it getting tougher and tougher to progress? That's probably a time to switch. And then again, too, if something is not feeling 100% or it's feeling off a little bit, starting to again, maybe stretch your joints a bit more, that's probably a good time to switch it out. Those are things I'm asking clients, also too, just being proactive and asking them ahead of time, hey, is there anything you would like to take out, things like that. But those would kind of be the things that I'm like, all right. And then too, just again, I kind of mentioned this, but just if the lift's starting to plateau, like, I think people get married to exercises and they think that they need to have certain exercises in, but if someone's starting to plateau for you, there's nothing wrong with taking it out for a little bit. A specific example for me is barbell bench press. Like I haven't done it for a while, because like what happens with me, once I like keep it in for a while, I keep trying to, progress. And eventually it's just like, it becomes more of a, hey, I just need to lift more weight with it. And it just gets a little stale. Right. And so like taking some time away from it can be a great thing. And now I brought it back in this week for this new mezzo. And it's, the first time I did it, it felt great. Right. So it's like, taking time away from it is super important. Yeah. Are you going to lose a little strength on it? Yes. But you'll get that back over time too, though.
I love it, man. That's a great point. Like this SFR of movements, single fatigue ratio, can change pretty dramatically over time. You probably will need to eventually swap out. And again, with variation, it's a fine line because we can easily go too hard in the direction of too much variation. But that's a great point. Like if a movement is going stale, if you're creating joint pain, I really like to look at have we seen this progress over the mesocycle versus, which of course that can vary too. Like if we are like in slightly higher volume and maybe we're like doing more downsets, of course that varies, but like generally are we seeing progression here? And then I think that too, like the mental side of things, if you're like, fuck, I know that's how split squats are for me, like fuck, this is making me dread going to the gym, then you have to do hard shit, of course, to build muscle. But on the same token, like if you could get just good of a stimulus from like a leg press, it's probably, and not hit your training sessions and probably not be as gas afterwards, it's probably a good substitute.
Yeah, well, and think about it too from, again, this is the beauty of building muscles. There's no must-do exercise. But I mean, if you're dreading an exercise, are you going to push yourself as hard on it? Probably not. You're, again, like you said with the split squat, like you're just like, fuck, I don't want to do this. Like you're probably not going to push yourself as hard. Maybe you do for a little bit, but eventually you're just going to be like, dude, I'm done with this. I don't want to push it today. And I think one thing it is important to stress this too is, I mentioned there's no must-do exercise for building muscle, right? But, so you don't have to get married to exercise, which is great. But if you are specifically trying to get stronger in a lift, like if you're a power lifter, it's probably better to stick to certain exercises more. So like, again, it kind of just comes down to what your goal is with it. But if you don't have to do it, like don't keep pushing it, like switch it out.
I love it, man. I couldn't agree more. So then when we're talking about exercise selection, when you're looking at good movements for building muscle, are there kind of some keys that you're typically looking for?
What, like when I'm choosing an exercise for it?
Yeah, exactly.
I think kind of the things, first of all, can you hear that outside?
No, you're good.
You're good. Okay. Sorry. I don't know if I can hear it. So
no worries, man.
So I think when choosing an exercise for building muscle, this kind of comes down to what we've already talked about a little bit, but like, the stimulus to fatigue ratio, making sure that whatever exercise you're choosing, you feel it in the target muscle. So again, if you're doing a bench press and you don't feel it in your chest and you're trying to hit your chest, is it a great exercise? No, you probably want to find something else that's going to hit your chest more.
Right.
Sorry, this is really loud and it's bugging me. And then too, but the main thing is making sure you enjoy it and making sure that you're hitting the target muscle there. I think those are probably the two biggest things that we need to figure out if we want to keep that exercise in or not. I don't know if you have anything else you want to add on to that.
No, for sure. I think the biggest thing too is just, I always talk about rate limiters, right? Like what's the thing that's causing you to stop the set? If it is like, I'm doing a squat on a Bosu ball and I'm just so unstable. Whereas like I'm doing squats because I want to build my quads, but the thing that's actually causing me to stop the set is like I'm just super unstable and the balance is off. Okay, that's probably not like the best movement, right? Or
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And I think that goes back to specificity, like we talked about at the beginning, right? Like squatting on a Bosu ball is not very specific to the muscle, right? It's more so balance than it is actually building muscle.
right, exactly. And I think like if you can just take that and like think through movements like that, and it really ties into stimulus to fatigue ratio as well. But like if your grip is the limiter, if your core strength is the limiter, or even like if the fact that you just don't want to fucking do this movement is the limiter, like it's all important things to consider. But I really think if we look at that, like we could talk about range of motion, all these other components, but I think that's really like one of the biggest things that people need to grasp is just like, why am I doing this? What's the thing that's causing me to actually stop the set? Is it like my cardio system being gassed? Is it these different things? And that's so helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad you brought up the like, for example, the grip. I feel like that's one thing that that ends up being a limiting factor. And it's like, okay, you're not training your grip. You're training, like, for example, in the lat pull down, you're training your lats, not your grip. And so if that is a limiting factor, that's obviously you're not targeting the muscle like you should, you know. And again, I think that again goes back to specificity on that. But that is an important thing to bring up to people because they commonly, you know, it's like, oh, you know, my forearms. It's like we're not trying to hit our forearms there. We're hitting our lats.
Right. No, absolutely, dude. Cool. I love it. So when we're prescribing rep ranges, do you have some general recommendations or how do you generally go about choosing like the rep ranges the client's going to be using?
Yeah. So this was something that changed my mind on recently. I'm sure you have too, but you know, I think people think when they first start building muscle, it's like you need to be in like the 8 to 12 rep range. And that is a great rep range for, you know, making sure you're lifting heavy enough, but you're also getting enough volume in. But, you know, studies have shown that you can go anywhere up to 5 to 30 reps, so long as you're training relatively hard. So again, that goes back to what we talked about earlier, making sure you're training hard enough. So long as again it's challenging enough and we're within that 5 to 30 rep range, you know, those are you're probably the rep range doesn't matter as much, right? But you know, you're probably not going to do certain exercises in certain rep ranges. So for example, if you're doing back squats, you're probably not going to do 20 to 30 reps on a back squat, right? Like you're going to be in the lower rep range.
Hey.
So some exercises do better with certain rep ranges. You know, but I do generally find that most of my training, clients training, is going to be anywhere between like 8 to 15 reps, but we're also sometimes we're going to go closer to 5 and sometimes we're going to go closer to 20 and higher. It just kind of depends on where you're at in your training, what exercise you're doing, what you find works best for you. That's going to be the big thing in it too, is what works best for you. You know, maybe for some people 5 to 10 is the range. They love lifting a little bit heavier. They feel great with 5 to 10, but then somebody else, 5 to 10 sucks. Can you hang on one sec?
Yeah, absolutely, man.
Sorry about that, man.
Yeah, dude.
So yeah, you know, just always kind of varying I think finding what works best for you and varying that and not being married again to, like we've talked about throughout this conversation, not being married to one exercise, but also don't be married to one rep range. I think that's super important there with the rep range.
No, absolutely. And I think a lot of it, honestly, if we just say like 5 to 30 rep range fits your our target, most people would probably intuitively kind of gravitate towards what you would prescribe anyways, right? Like, okay, my back squats, I really don't want to go too far past 12 reps because I just feel fucking exhausted when I go past that. Same thing with like my Romanian deadlift. On the flip side, if I try to do like a 5 rep lateral raise, I just basically feel like I feel my traps and maybe my biceps and my form is just shit. So that has to be typically like at least 10 reps, it seems like. So I think it kind of intuitively, I like to typically say like across a training day, first 2 to 3 movements if all are typically that's going to be when we're going to do our heaviest work, right? And I don't know, I almost think that like thinking about this from like, hey, let's making sure we're hitting all these different muscle fiber types is probably getting way too far in the weeds versus like where everyone needs to go. But maybe there's a little bit of merit to, okay, sometime in the 5 to 10 range, sometime in the 10 to 20 range, sometimes in the 20 to 30 range where we're hitting like fast twitch fibers and then we're getting to like slower twitch fibers as well. But I think intuitively, like, hey, if first couple of movements of your training day, should probably be your heavier ones that are going to be in like 5 to 10 or 5 to 12 range. From there, we're probably going to spend the next 2 to 3 in the 10 to 20 range. And maybe the next couple, maybe we'll venture up to like 25 to even 30 reps if it's like a lateral raise or a pec tech. Honestly, though, it's pretty rare. I'd say I program past 20 reps. I don't know about you.
Yeah, I think sometimes I go over 20 in my training, but definitely I think anything over 20, like that's going to be something that's you don't do that very often. It's going to be something if you do it, it's just going to be very short lived and you're not going to go there very often. Again, that's going to be something more like the first thing that comes to mind would be like a tricep pull down or like you said, a lateral raise or something like that. Those would be the ones that you're going to program there. But for the most part, yeah, 20 to 30, you can still build muscle there, but is it the most effective? Probably not as effective as being in like the 10 to 20 rep range. So I agree with that.
Cool. And I something that I actually noticed, I remember like when I first started programming for you and I saw like your previous programming, is I think that even like more, I honestly, like personally, I really hate getting like high reps on anything outside of like a lateral raise. But I remember like looking at your program and damn, like even over for me personally, it's like, fuck, this is past 15 reps. I've gotten better about it as I've started like, as Steve has done my program, like gone there more. But I remember like leading your program in a lot of like, even like 15 getting up to like 20 reps of more like bicep curls and leg presses and things of that nature. I was like, damn, dude, shit looks exhausting. But go ahead.
No, it is. And like, I've had, sometimes I'll work out with a training partner and he kind of calls me out on that sometimes. And I'm like, cause he's kind of more of like lift heavy type. He's kind of has that bodybuilder, bro bodybuilder mentality. And like, he'll kind of call me out on it. But, again, it just kind of comes down to what works best for you. Like if you like that, then do it. I don't necessarily love it, but I personally would rather go a little bit lighter and push it a little bit, closer to failure and do a little more reps. That's just how I enjoy training, so I think it really just comes down to what are you going to adhere to best.
No, absolutely. And that shows though too, and like you have such good quality, man. Like I also know that like I had you shoot me form videos, I think the first week that we worked together, and after that I was like, all right, dude, you're good. Because everything looks impeccable. And I imagine like for you, so much of that is like you can very clearly tell you spent a long time mastering that, as opposed to like, I know for me, for the longest time I was on the other end of the spectrum where it was like, okay, I just need to lift heavy ass weight. Like I was very much like in your friend's camp. And I think that very much I know came back to bite me. But
Yeah. Into like my thought process on it, we've talked about this, like my thought process on it is going to be, I'm trying to do, I don't want to say as little weight, but I'm trying I'm trying to do as little weight as I can while making it challenging, just because I want to do this long term. I want to be the guy that's 50 years old, still looking jacked, like that's what I want, so I'm trying to go more long term with it. And so like, I think that, again, lifting heavy is not bad, but I do think that it comes with a little bit more of an injury risk, and the long-term sustainability is not as good if you just focus more on the quality of each movement,
right,
essentially.
I can.
But it's sometimes it's tough on the ego though, because you're like seeing some guy lift way more than you, and you're just like, all right, whatever. I'm not gonna worry about it though.
Oh no, for sure. I remember like, it was just like a year ago. My squat weight, basically, when I started working with Steve, we like cut it in half, because it was like, dude, squats, I really struggled to like get to like grow my quads with squats. It's like, well, you're just going to parallel. So like, here's what I want you to do. I was like, fuck, I just had to drop like over 100 pounds from the bar. But again, like, oh shit, okay, all of a sudden now my legs are actually making progress from squats again. Weird how that works, right? So no, that's a great point, dude. Anything else you want to add as far as rep ranges go?
No, I think again, the biggest takeaway is don't marry one rep range. Obviously find what works best for you and probably make sure most of your training is in that rep range. But don't get married to one rep range. Go outside of it every once in a while. And that's really my biggest takeaway there from that. I feel like that's kind of the biggest thing there is just kind of get a little uncomfortable with the rep ranges, but also stick pretty closely to what you enjoy best and feel like you grow from the best.
I like it, dude. I'd say a good rule of thumb is, okay, about 2/3 of your training is probably in that what you enjoy. The other, just putting arbitrary numbers on it, but about 1/3 is on the other, like, let's say you enjoy that 10 to 20, or like even let's say like 8 to 12. Okay, 2/3 is in there. The other 1/3 is like 15 to 25 and 5 to 10. Cool. When it comes to progression across a mesocycle, can you talk us through typically, like, do you have like a pre-plan, hey, here's how we're going to try to push you to progress, or what's that like for you when you're programming for clients?
Yeah. So me and you talked about this kind of at the beginning, but I like to do RAR, like lower the RAR, get closer to failure across a mesocycle. So, say it's a 5 weeks. First week, you're like 2 to 3 reps, and then each week you just get closer to failure. I do like to do some set increases, but the more I learn, the more I'm not like just dead set on set increases. I do like them, and I think that they're useful. But it's a case by case basis. Again, if I like to track things like recovery, how sore somebody is. Like if somebody's super sore, obviously we're not going to add sets. But if somebody's not getting super sore, and like we see, like, again, like the what we talked about earlier, where maybe their sets are 10, 10, 10, maybe it's a good idea to throw in another set. Or if they want a certain body part to grow, maybe we'll increase sets a bit more on that exercise, right? But basically I like to start the training a little bit less intense, but then as the mesocycle goes on, we're increasing that intensity. So on average, it ends up being, like we talked about, probably 2 RIR. Maybe that first week it's 3, then it's 2, 2, then 1, or something like that, for an average of 2.
Okay.
So that's what I like to do best there. And then 2 weight increases too, maybe some small weight, but let me go back on that. So when you're increasing or lowering your RIR, you're going to have to increase reps or increase sets or increase weight somewhere, right? Like that's just going to happen. So, and this is something that RP talks about, Dr. James and Dr. Mike talk about a lot, is you don't necessarily have to use the RIR each week, but stay about 2 to 3 reps away from failure in that first week, and then just try to either add weight, add reps, or add sets, and until you get for like 4 to 5 weeks. And eventually, you'll overload, but you also don't have to overthink the RIR, right? Because you can overthink the RIR. I'm sure you probably, like, I overthink it too, right? But like if you just get that baseline in that first week to where it's like, okay, I'm not overdoing it, but I know I can progress. And so I think that's a good rule of thumb. Like stay 2 to 3 reps away in that first week, and then increase from there. And don't just add sets to make it harder. Make sure that if you're adding sets, there's a reason behind it. Do you want that body part to grow? Or are you not feeling like you're getting sore or feeling that muscle at all? Then you probably need to add a little bit of some sets to it. But yeah.
Absolutely, man. I think with set increases, I probably got a little bit more conservative than I used to be. I know, like, you're someone, okay, like lower body is pretty much at maintenance volume, right? It's basically like 6 sets across your entire lower body training day. So there it's where, okay, we're really pushing for more upper body gain. So there we're a lot. You're the most aggressive I am with anyone actually with set increases like week to week. But typically I think that like range, typically as of late, I've been starting people a little bit higher, and then not so like 3 sets per movement, let's say, to start out, as opposed to like sometimes it'd go like 2 to 1.
2.
Like the range is a little bit smaller. Like, okay, maybe we're gonna bump it up to 4 on these movements that we're really progressing, or maybe even 5, like occasionally. Honestly, I don't think most people don't even need to go to that point. Because it's very interesting to look at, like, okay, what are the proxies for set increases, right? And sometimes it's like, okay, this client is making great progress on, let's say, 3 sets of their bench press, and thus they're getting a lot stronger week to week. So can we guarantee that, like, and that's like where the like progression, this whole debate comes in, right? Like Brian Miner on the podcast was someone that had me thinking about this so much as well, because it is a completely different perspective. But like, okay, how do we know like adding sets isn't going to actually decrease the returns from that? But then so I've gotten a lot less aggressive, I would say, with adding sets week to week, which it sounds like is more or less where you're at as well.
Yeah, instead of like, and I think this is, like you said, this is something like kind of that debate, and this is what got me thinking about it. But it's like, don't just add sets just to add sets. Like make sure that there's reason behind it, and again, if you're not getting sore in a certain muscle group that you want to grow, then you probably can add a little bit more. So maybe increasing the sets there would be a good idea. But again, if just adding sets just to add sets probably isn't the best course of action.
Absolutely. That's a good perspective. Like if I would say if you have a baseline of execution, so like execution is good with like movement, but you're not like this muscle group isn't growing as a whole, but it's definitely not like, damn, I just feel gassed here. We know it's not a recovery deficit, then that's probably a good time to like, okay, we can add more volume here. But yeah, I would say typically now, I don't know where you're at, but probably most people start 2 to 3 movements for most exercises at the start of the mesocycle, and then end 4 to maybe 5 sets for most movements across the mesocycle. I'd say even like getting up to about 5 is pretty rare for most dudes that we work with that are training 4 times a week or more. And then a little bit more common with women. Do you feel like that's about where yours fall or a bit different?
Yeah, and that's a good point you bring up too. You know, it ends up being the top range 5. I don't know about you, but anytime like I'm thinking about adding volume to somebody's program and they're already at like 5 sets on an exercise, and it's like they're say for example it's like a tricep pull down or something. They're already at 5 sets. Their triceps aren't getting like very sore. I'm like, I don't think I'm gonna add a 6th set. Like I feel like after 5 sets, if you're not feeling it, and you're not getting it's probably a quality thing at that point, right? It's not so much a we need to add more. It's probably a quality issue at that point because even if you do go up to 6 sets, how good is the quality going to be anyways once you get to that 6th set? Probably not very good. I know Dr. Mike talks about this a lot where he's just like, anything more than 5 sets for one exercise is probably too much. You need to start adding to it to another exercise because you're just, it goes back to the split squat example that we talked about. If you're not looking forward to doing it, you're not going to put as much effort into it and the quality is not going to be there. So it's kind of the same thing there. I think once you get over 5, it's just like, okay, it's probably a quality issue then at that point.
No, I couldn't agree more, dude. Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. And we could even get into like, okay, we should probably have about this many movements within training day, and then like if you're doing more than, then we're kind of like past the peak. But that's a whole another like hour and a half episode. I know you got to run here pretty quick, dude, and I want to be respectful of your time. This has been a great conversation. I know people will take a ton of application from this. Before I let you go, brother, will you just tell everyone where they can find you? Anything at all you want to plug?
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram, JeffH91 _. And then my podcast, the Mind Muscle Connection podcast, which you've been on there twice. We're going to get you on there again soon, whether you want to or not. No, I'm just kidding, obviously.
Got to do that photo shoot for me first, dude.
Yeah, well, yeah. I'm still waiting on those pictures. I'll send them over here soon. And then my website is jhhealth.net, and I just write blogs and stuff on there. So those would be the best places to find me.
Dope, dude. I will link all that up in the show notes. And again, thank you for being here, man. It's always fun to chat.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. I was honored to be on. So appreciate it.
Absolutely, dude.